My name is Jerome Ferry. My cameraman is Alan Eggers. We're doing a video interview with Frank Scheibel, an early Cedar Rapidian with a long career in the U.S. Air Corps, the U.S. Air Force, and the United States Air Forces. Frank, tell us what year you were born in and where you were born.
Well, Jerry, I was born February 4th, 1919. As you probably know, a lot of soldiers were coming back from Europe at that time, and influenza was rampant. Therefore, babies had to be born in a home. I was born in the 300 block of 4th Avenue, right behind where the Union Station used to stand.
What was your folks' name?
My father was Edward Paul Scheibel, my mother Florence M. Scheibel. I had a brother, Paul, who was 9 years older than I.
9 years old. Where did you go to grade school?
Years later, when I started grade school at age 5, I attended Buchanan between 20th and 21st Street on Mount Vernon Avenue.
Mm-hmm. And high school?
Well, first I went to middle school, or junior high, which happened to be McKinley, located on 10th Street. And 3 years there. Then I went to Washington High, old Washington High, down by Union Station and the railroad tracks.
Do you have any special memories of old Washington?
Oh, indeed I do. Washington was like a college campus. It had the main building, the Adams Annex, which incidentally is where the Wright brothers went to school. I had several classes in that annex myself, such as math and literature, as I recall. And the men's gym was Sokol Gym over on 3rd Street. The ladies' gym was the YWCA. Our assembly area was the new Paramount Theater on 3rd Avenue. And we practiced football and basketball out at Franklin Junior High School.
What was your dad's occupation?
My father was a graduate of a business school. He immediately went to work for a company named James Paul Dunn and Company. They operated a series of newsstands and restaurants along the right-of-way of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. And later that company, the Paul Dunn and Company, was taken over by the Union News Company. And my father then became a member of Union News Company.
I imagine you had the opportunity to go down to the train station, Union Depot?
Yes, many, many times. My father ran that place in early years as a youngster when I was at Buchanan. And a few years later, about the time I was at McKinley, he became a supervisor of all of the operations of Union News Company from Chicago through the Chicago Northwestern line, such towns as Proviso, Clinton, Cedar Rapids, Marshalltown, or Belle Plaine, Marshalltown, Ames, Boone, Council Bluffs, Omaha, up to Chadron, and on the north route all the way to Green Bay, Wisconsin. Those were his operations.
Now, what do you remember what would have been his responsibilities, what his duties were?
Yes, he hired people to run these operations, which were newsstands and restaurants in the railroad stations on the Chicago Northwestern line.
I'm going to tax your memory a little bit here, and I'm going to ask you about the different topics that will take you back in time. The Krandic. Did you ever take any trips to Iowa City in the Krandic line?
Yes, I remember stopping at Oakdale, which at that time was a place for people with chest disease. I can't even think of the name of it.
Pneumonia?
Not pneumonia.
TB?
Tuberculosis. Used to have a stop there. Yes, I rode the Krandic. That stands for Cedar Rapids and Iowa City Railroad.
How about the trolleys?
The trolleys. Yes, we had a line right on Mount Vernon Avenue. I lived later life at 19th Street, virtually Mount Vernon Avenue. And that line went right downtown, of course. And I used to get on at 19th Street right out to the end of the line at Forest Drive and help the motorman shift all the seats from back to front. You know, I'd go along the line. He let me do this when he'd take his driving material and put it on the other end of the car.
How about horses? You still remember horses?
Oh,
carriages and buggies and
let's see.
Delivery wagons?
If I tax my memory, 3 I remember distinctly, Jerry. One was the Iceman, of course. And he always chiseled his ice cakes. People would have their signs in the window, either 25 gallons, 50, 100. And when he would chisel the ice, obviously some flakes would come off, and the kids would follow him, grab an ice flake and eat it. Yes, that's one. Second, I distinctly remember, was Krebs Dairy, I believe it was called, out on First Avenue, about the old viaduct where LaPlante Choate used to be, right in that area. And they had a horse-drawn ice cream wagon. And we always enjoyed that because the bell would ring, and we'd run out with a nickel and get a cup of ice cream. And the third one, to me, was the most interesting of all. It was an elderly man, bent over, always wore a hat, and as you down the street, you could hear him wailing this song, "Rags newspapers." He would repeat that over and over. He was collecting, of all things, recyclables, as we do today. Bless his heart.
He was probably a very wealthy man.
I don't know. I presume he sold his. I don't know, Jerry.
How about, you remember your dad's first automobile? Or did he have one?
Well, my father and mother were married in 1908. He had a horse and buggy. His horse's name was Dewey. And he traded this horse and buggy in on a 1908 Buick. And he bought that in Clinton, Iowa. He drove it into Chicago. He came back to Iowa, and it was the first car in Iowa to have electric headlights in lieu of carbide headlights. Carbide was the standard at that time. So he had 1908. The first car I can remember he had was a 1923 Cadillac. Then he had a 26 Cadillac. Then he went into Hupmobiles.
I can imagine a lot of the roads were mud.
Most. I distinctly remember the Lincoln Highway when it was completed, old Route 30. Frequently, when Dad was in from his job of traveling, we would run out to what he called the 6 Mile corner on the Lincoln Highway, and Sprentzel had a sandwich shop out there, and we'd get a bottle of grape pop and a sandwich. So yes, and dirt roads, heavens yes. In the Cadillac, we went to Pikes Peak when I was a toddler. I still have a picture of my family on the top of Pikes Peak. That must have been about 1923, I would say, something like that.
Do you remember there was a stretch of pavement, they put it in to do a test study on it between Mount Vernon and Cedar Rapids, and it was called the Seedling Mile. It was 1 mile of pavement.
I do not recall that at all. I'm sorry. Was that down by the Palisades, I presume?
It was, no, it was on the old highway. Going down through
Mount Vernon, Lisbon, Mechanicsville?
No, it would be on the old Mount Vernon, what they call the old Mount Vernon Highway. Maybe it was the old Lincoln.
Well, Mount Vernon Road became the Lincoln Highway, yes, in Cedar Rapids.
Yes.
It did indeed.
Yes, it was.
And then number 30 went all the way to Chicago, through Clinton and the Illinois towns, yes.
How about early floods, like 1929?
The one
You would
thing
have been about 10 years old.
One thing I remember, my Uncle Bill, for whom my son is named, by the way, took me down to the Paramount Theater. It had been completed, I believe, the year before, and the entire basement of the Paramount was full of water, believe it or not. It was indeed.
You had mentioned in your in the pre-interview of John Philip Sousa. You had a story to tell about.
I guess one of my most memorable incidents happened years ago. I was just a toddler, and John Philip Sousa was coming to Cedar Rapids for a band concert. He had retired as the founder of the United States Marine Corps Band, which is still in operation, of course, but he had his own band. And he happened to be a Mason. My father was a Mason. And Dad took me down to the Shrine Temple, which was up on A Avenue at that time, near the old Masonic Temple. And after the concert, my dad was fortunate enough to meet him, and in turn, I shook hands with John Philip Sousa. And that was the thrill of my life, even though I was a toddler. And one man in his band I distinctly remember was a fellow named Bogart Krill. He was at that time the world's most famous trumpeter.
How about early radio? Did you ever have any interest in radio?
Well, I never built a radio per se, but I did play around with crystal sets. And my friend and I, Jack Coffrin, who is still my best friend, still alive, we built crystal sets and built a little trailer behind our bicycle with wagon wheels and a little box. We carried our crystal sets there, so if we went on a steak fry at Indian Creek, we'd take our crystal sets and see if we could get a station. And usually it was the local station, which I believe was KCRP, is that it? KCRG maybe? I don't know.
How old would Art Collins have been at this time?
This was probably the time either prior to his contact with Richard Byrd in the North Pole or just after that. It must have been prior to, because I saw Admiral Byrd at McKinley at one of our assemblies. I remember that. So it must have been prior to. And he, what age? I don't know.
Admiral Byrd come and spoke at McKinley?
At McKinley. You know what I got as a memorial from him? He smoked a cigarette, and I got his cigarette butt and took it home. My dad knocked it off my hand. But I thought that was amazing, getting something that Admiral Byrd had had.
How about telephones? Did your folks have a telephone?
Oh, yes, we were on a party system, but I remember calling my father at the Union Station. I even remember the number, 5601. You know, operator, yes, 5601, please.
How about early motion pictures? Did you go to see the matinee on Saturday afternoon?
Yes, we did. And normally it was either at the Rialto or the Isis or the Palace, sometimes the Old State or Strand. This was before the Paramount in Iowa came into being. And usually they were cowboy shows. Even before Tom Mix, as Ken Maynard, I remember Bob Steele, Tom Mix, a couple other fellas that we all dearly portrayed as children, and those movies on Saturday matinees always had a serial, way out things like space travel way back when, and it would end with some thrilling thing, and you'd have to come the next week to see the continuation of it. And there was always the newsreels. I always enjoyed the newsreels.
Did you ever hear of Chautauqua? Did you ever have the opportunity your parents ever take you to one of these cultural events?
Chautauqua was a traveling road show, so to speak, stage shows primarily, under huge tents like a circus tent. Now, I personally did not see one, but I heard my parents talk about them. I heard my in-laws talk about them.
Circuses. You ever recall any circuses coming to town?
Yes. I remember seeing Wild Bill Cody, Buffalo Bill here, and the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, of course. And what I particularly remember were the enormous parades from the unloading at the Union Station up either 3rd or 1st Avenue. 1st Avenue. Yes, it was 1st. Crowds lining, say, from the railroad tracks, all the way up to Bruce Moore and beyond, because these elephants were walking, the calliope was playing, the clowns were clowning, and so on.
And where did they set up then?
Normally in Kenwood, I think at that time it was called Seymour Acres, something like that. There was a roller coaster there, a small dance place, and entertainment for the family.
Yeah. Green's Opera House.
Green's Opera House was located on, across the street from the Troy Laundry and Dance Land, and it had been converted into an athletic building at my young age, because my Uncle Bill took me to several boxing matches there, at which Alex Fiddler was the referee. And this first time I'd ever seen a boxing bout, with gloves and so on. And I know I was kind of impressed with these guys that could punch like that. And then later years, yes, my wife, the third date I had with my wife at Co., as a matter of fact, I took her there because it was a dance place. They had a nice band, and college kids could go down there and dance. Mm-hmm.
Did your dad ever expect you boys to have a job like delivering papers or mowing grass in the summertime?
I can't say, other than our own yard, and I used to shovel neighbors' walks, not for money, but I guess because my dad was a good guy, and he sent me over there and said, do this, help these folks. No, I really didn't have a job per se to earn money. I did things around the home for my few cents that I would get to go to a movie or buy a candy bar or something like that.
How about camp? Did you get to go to camp?
I went to Camp Wapsie Y. I did indeed as a youngster for a couple of weeks. And I remember Lee Horsley was a counselor there, and I think our parents confided in him, these young men ought to know a little more about the birds and the bees, and out at Camp Wapsie Y is where I found out about life, which was very smart back in those years.
Yes. Was your dad a fun type guy?
Yeah, Dad was gone so much, Jerry. He would leave Sunday night and get home Friday night, so I enjoyed my father really on Saturday and Sunday. But when he was home, he was a wonderful family man. He would take us every place. Weekends, inevitably, he would say, oh, let's go down to Davenport and eat at the hotel down there. Okay, we'll go down there. Maybe the next weekend he was home, he said, let's go up to the Waterloo and eat at the Russell Lamson Hotel. Okay, let's do that. Or we'd go to Marshalltown, let's say, and eat at Stone's Cafe, and then maybe go out to the park, and my brother and I would throw a ball around. Pretty soon Dad's out there playing ball with us, or kicking a football. Yeah, Dad was a good dad, I tell you.
Were they church-going people?
Yes, they were. They attended a church on 3rd Avenue, and I think it was called the Christian Church or Christian Union. It was up beyond People's Church, and it has columns in front of it. I don't quite remember the name. But it's odd, when they went there, I went to St. Paul's, and my brother was going to Westminster Presbyterian. So all we missed was a synagogue and a Catholic church, I guess.
How about the 4th of July? Was that a big time for you and your brother?
Well, not necessarily my brother. He was 9 years older than I.
You and your brother probably weren't all that close, were you?
Until I grew up a little more. When I could start wearing his clothes, his shirts, his suits, his ties, I loved him. No, we really weren't, except for 3 years, he had a Model A Ford, and he took my best friend, this Jack Crawford I mentioned, and me, on road trips. One year, we drove all the way to New York. Then New York, we went down to Florida. Here we were, 13, 14 years old. So my brother was very good to my best buddy and me. We saw a lot of states, many more than most kids did our age.
Now, how about the 4th of July?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. 4th of July. All I can remember about that is we always got up as early as we could, say along 5 a.m., and we wanted to light off the first firecracker in the neighborhood, which was what we used to call a 5-incher. You know, it was about 5 inches long, and we'd light it and throw it and run like the dickens.
Fireworks were legal then?
Yes, they were, and very dangerous.
Where would you go to buy fireworks? In a hardware store?
No, a drugstore handled them. They had a tray out in front of Ledege's drugstore at 19th and Mount Vernon. You'd go up there, I want this torpedo, and I want this bunch of ladyfingers. And you'd buy them at local merchants.
How about Christmas? Does any of them stick out in your mind? Was that a fun time around your home?
Yes, it always was. Our Christmas was always Christmas Eve, not Christmas morning, because we always went to church then. But we always celebrated as a family Christmas Eve.
Mm-hmm. I know you're not old enough to remember the Douglas Starch Works, but I do know you were on the scene at that time.
Yeah, it's a story my folks always told me. Being born at home, and shortly after I was born, the Starch Works blew up, so my parents told me, and it threw me out of my crib or bed, wherever I was, and obviously I landed on my head because I don't remember much from then on.
When you were in high school, Frank, you were active in sports, I think you said.
Yes, at Washington, I played sophomore football and basketball on Washington High team, Old Washington. Then at McKinley, I played football, basketball, and I was captain of the second football team at McKinley.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever play at Hill Park?
Oh yeah, that's where all the football games were held. That's where the Cedar Rapids Bunnies used to play. Used to ride the streetcar over to see the Cedar Rapids Bunny, and I'll never forget one manager named Paul Spirow, and he was marvelous. He was my hero idol at that time. And then I well remember Rocky Colavito, who played for I think they were called the Rabbits or the Raiders after that.
Hill was named after Belden Hill, right? Belden Hill, were you aware of him? Did he have a business in Cedar Rapids? Or?
I'm aware of him through my father, Jerry. Belden Hill operated a cigar store and shoe shine. That's hard, you know. A shoe shine stand. Triple alliteration. How about that? On 3rd Avenue, and it was right across from the old Strand State Theater, between the Morehouse Barbershop, if you remember where that was, and Sears, which was the end thing by the Union Station. It was right in that area. And yes, Belden Hill, I heard my father talk about that name, that fella or whatever.
Yeah. When you used to take the trolley out there to ball games, what did it cost you to get in?
Well, I usually went with my brother or my parents. I'm sure it was pennies, Jerry. I honestly don't know. I don't recall going there alone other than with some fellas, and I don't recall what it was.
Do you recall if they had large crowds back in those days at the ball games?
Well, we always sat in the third base line, so, you know, we could see those wonderful plays. And that part of the bleachers was pretty well full, and around the home plate always was, of course. Now, the first base line was very small, as I recall. So, crowds, 2,000 maybe, I would guess.
Okay, so young Frank graduated from high school. What year did you graduate from high school, Frank?
Well, it was 1937, and I was a mid-year student, January 31st.
Okay, and then you went to college.
The following September, I entered Co, yes. Mm-hmm. Now, during that period, I attended McKinley as what they used to call postgraduate, where I learned to type and took a couple of Mickey Mouse courses, and, you know, and I also worked at Paramount Theater at that time.
As a usher?
No, I was pulling tickets out in the lobby, and the Versailles lobby.
How old were you when you got your first automobile, and what type was it?
Well, I was at Co, and let's see, I was either the second semester sophomore or first year junior, so that would have been in 1939, and it was a 1927 Ford. May I tell you a story about that?
Mm-hmm.
My dad came in from the road on Friday night, and I said, "Dad, come on out, take a look at my car." And he says, "Gee, that's a beauty, Frank." He says, "Isn't it a shame you can't drive it?" I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Do you have insurance?" I said, "No." He says, "That's why you can't drive it." He says, "Do a little work, get your insurance, then you can drive it." So.
Lesson number one, owning an automobile. So in Co College, did you recall Grant Wood?
No, I recall Grant Wood at McKinley Junior High because one of his best friends was our principal, Frances Prescott. And I believe Miss Prescott owned some sketches and paintings by Grant Wood. But I don't recall him at Co. I recall Marvin Cohn at Co., who was sort of not a contemporary, who followed about a decade later than Grant Wood, I believe.
Did you know a Roby Kessler?
Yes, I do. I've seen her a couple of times at reunions, and years ago, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, she was in my brother's class at Co, class of 32, or either 33 or 31, but my brother knew her very well, yes.
Elma Turchek?
Yes, she was still on staff while I was at Co, a great pianist and a wonderful music professor. Now, I did not have contact with her per se because I wasn't in that particular field.
You had talked about Tate Cummins.
Yes?
He was you knew him.
Well, I knew him in later life through my correspondence when I was overseas.
Okay.
That's how I became acquainted with Tate.
You had mentioned a gentleman that gave the commencement address at your graduation.
Jerry, I'll never forget that. Again, here's, like John Philip Sousa, one of the greats in my mind that I'd ever met. And his name was, oh Lord, don't tell me I've forgotten his name. He wrote Berlin Diary and The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich.
William
And
Schreier.
his name was William L. Shire. Now, yeah, thanks a lot.
Sorry,
It finally came back to me. William Shire was a fraternity brother of mine, a member of Tau Kappa Epsilon at Cole many years ago, and he was a dear friend of Grant Wood's. So I met Bill Shire after my commencement because he was our commencement speaker in 1941 at Cole. And he was a Cole graduate, you know.
Were you active in sports at Cole College also?
My freshman year, I started out for football, and for some reason I quit. I don't know. I didn't like it. I did numeral in basketball at Cole, but again, I didn't go in for the varsity. I quit. And again, I don't know why, because I always liked athletics. Mm-hmm. But intramurals became a passion of mine. Matter of fact, in '39, I think it was, I won the belt buckle for best intramural athlete. Big deal, you know. That and a nickel buy a cup of coffee.
Cole College had a government program where they were teaching flyers. Did you ever have any interest in flying, and how did you get that interest?
Well, I guess we'll have to segue back to 1927 in May, when Charles Augustus Lindbergh flew the ocean all by his lonesome. That was the start of my interest in aviation.
That made quite an impression on you.
Oh yes. I think every it's like the first 7 astronauts, you know. Wally Schirra was a hero. Armstrong was a hero of these kids. Well, Lindbergh was our hero in my era. Yes, that interested me in aviation.
When did you have your first exposure to an airplane?
Well, you probably laugh at this, but in 1932, my family took me into the World's Fair in Chicago. I won't mention, we didn't see Sally Rand, Jerry. I know she was there, you know, even as a kid, but Dad took me down to Lake Michigan. He says, let's go for an airplane ride. And I said, sure, let's go. And it happened to be a Sikorsky twin-engine seaplane that took off from Lake Michigan, flew around, I suppose, 15 minutes maybe. And I just thought that was so exciting, and to fly in, you know, be up there and look down at all these little people that look like ants and see a trolley going along and look like a toy. I just thought this was marvelous. That was my first flight, 1932, as a passenger.
So in Cole College,
Mm-hmm.
You got exposed to this flying program that Cole College had.
I did. It was called Civilian Pilot Training, which was a federally funded course at many universities and colleges to prepare young men to become pilots in anticipation of what might happen coming to our land from Europe. As you know, Hitler started a few years earlier than that.
Was this associated in any way with the ROTC?
No, it wasn't. ROTC was totally different. ROTC initially was for land-grant colleges under Abraham Lincoln to develop reserve officers. So your large institutions, such as Purdue, Iowa State, these land-grant colleges and universities are the first ones that had ROTC to produce reserve officers. Cole had an Army ROTC unit when I was there, under the direction of a major, and quite a few fellows took. The first 2 years were always mandatory. Then you could volunteer for junior and senior year, after which you were commissioned after a summer camp and all of this. But they were not connected. ROTC and the CPT had no bearing with each other.
The CPT, did you have to have any scholastic requirements, or did you have to meet any scholastic requirements to?
Not per se, like 1 to 10, no, but you had to have grades that were commensurate with a halfway literate individual. But the main thing was the physical exam, which was extremely strict, and it was conducted by Navy doctors, as I recall. We had the spin chair and all of this, and you'd pull cords for your depth perception, of which I have absolutely nothing, being blind now.
Yeah. Is this something you volunteered for, or did they say you're going to take this?
I like to say we bid for it. Yes, we volunteered, but they could only take so many. So let's assume 15 volunteered, maybe they took 10.
So where was this training?
The ground school was right on the co-campus in the science building, and Dr. Alfred E. Meyer was our professor for navigation, weather, things of this nature, and maintenance. And the actual flying took place out at the old Hunter Field on the old 218 south to Iowa City.
Who was your instructor?
Oh, he was a rambunctious cowboy named Pete Klemick. He lived in Mechanicsville, but he was a marvelous pilot. Marvelous pilot.
Did you know Dan or his son, Dan Jr.?
I knew both of them, yes. I knew that Dan had been in World War I, and Dan Jr. was a couple of years younger than I. Seems to me I played golf with Dan at one time. I know I did with John Jacobs, his buddy, but maybe I played with Dan, maybe I didn't.
And this program out there, did you go out to the airport? Did they bus you out to the airport?
No. We had to provide our own transportation. So at that time I had a Model A that took me out, and usually a couple guys would ride with me that were in the program. Jack Coffin was one. Ward Long, who lives here, is one. Jimmy Ralston, who was killed in World War II, was one. I can't think of the other names, but
Once a week, twice a week, or
flying?
Yeah.
I would say generally it was about 3 times a week. We'd go out in the afternoons, winter or summer, and we'd each fly 30, 40, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, with an instructor, and then the next fellow would get in, and then the next.
What type of plane did they?
That was an Aranca Chief that we took for primary, side-by-side seating, 40 horsepower, Sensen-H propeller. Nice little airplane.
Did they have any heat in them in the wintertime?
Yeah, I think there was a heater in them, as I recall.
Come off the manifold, probably.
Yeah. I'm not too sure about that, but it seems to me, because the day I sold it, I was on skis, not wheels.
Did you recall a gentleman by the name of Charlie Sheets?
Charlie?
Sheets? He was a chief mechanic out there, but I don't know if this was the time period or not.
That doesn't ring a bell, Jerry.
Okay. Was there any females, any women taking this instruction?
Not in the first class, and I don't believe in the second, but in the third class, I distinctly remember a girl named June Denio who was taking this CPT course.
Do you know if she ever went on to become a military pilot?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I saw something in the Co-Courier, our alumni magazine, the other day about June, and I can't think what it was.
You mentioned doing the solo on skis.
Yes?
Skis on the plane.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I hope so.
And did you have any problems doing your solo?
Well, not during CPT, but later I was flying my brother's Aranca Chief on skis. And I was doing a little cross-country work, I landed at Iowa City, and I was taxiing, and just then on the radio I heard that a airliner was coming in. Right over the fence, I was looking at it, and I went right into one of these snow fences, posts and metal, parallel bars here. I ran right into that with my brother's Aranca Chief and broke his propeller.
Was he with you?
No.
Probably just...
Yeah, I'm afraid he'd have slapped me a few times had he been with me. I still have that broken propeller, and I paid for it too, believe me.
Do you remember Saxon?
Ted Saxon, I do. He sold my brother, and real well-known name in Cedar Rapids, Jim Wathen, who ran the fixed base service here. Jim and my brother soloed at the same time with Ted Saxon. And his airport was out northeast someplace. I don't recall quite where.
It was at C Avenue and Blair's Ferry Road, where the Rockwell Collins parking lot is.
Okay.
Now,
Yeah, I knew it was north of town. I went out to that place a couple times and flew with my brother out of there a couple times.
So did you obtain a pilot's license? Was it a government license that you were given?
No, it was my first license was given to me by a band leader, if you can believe that, Frankie Trombar. Have you ever heard that name? Well, that's probably long before your time. At least I knew he was a band leader, but he was at that time a CAA inspector. And after I soloed, I had to take a test, and he signed my first pilot's license and gave it to me. And then after that, in CPT, I went into the secondary. We got into the tail dragon aircraft, the old Travel Air, and the Waco C. And that's when we got about 200 hours to take our commercial. Then after that, we went back in the light planes and learned to instruct the instructors to get an instructor's rating.
When you were going to Cole College, where did the college kids go for spring break back then?
Well, I think most students...
Was there such a thing as...
No, we had a marvelous day called Flunk Day, which I shouldn't relate to spring break, because that was a single day that the president of the student body said, today's the day, everybody take off, professors and everybody. And we'd go on picnics and stuff like that. I think on the spring vacation, which we always called Easter vacation, I think kids went home. I can remember so many of them lived in the Chicago environment. Wilmette, Evanston, Elgin, Des Plaines, those towns, Blue Island. A lot of co-kids came from that general area around Illinois.
They didn't go to Cole or Cancun or Florida or any place like that?
Not the only person I ever remember that even went to Hawaii was Dr. Knight's daughter. She came back with a grass skirt.
So what year did you graduate from Cole, Frank?
That was 1941, June the 9th.
And then, did you get married around this time, or?
Well, yeah, pretty close to it, but may I back up just a second? Mm-hmm. On my day of graduation, I was also commissioned a second lieutenant in the infantry. That was
in the infantry?
In the infantry, because that was the going thing at Co at that time, infantry. Later it became Air Force, but it was infantry. And all of us who got a commission on June the 9th were ordered to active duty for 1 year under what they called the Thomason Act. And we were all sent to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri on the 24th of June. So, a couple of weeks after we graduated, we were all in uniform on duty. Now, you ask when I was married. November 3rd of 1941, I had a couple days off. I drove up from Fort Leonard Wood, picked up my wife, and I says, let's go down to Missouri and get married, and away we went. We eloped. And right now we've been married a little over 61 years, so I guess it's going to hold.
Was she a local girl?
Oh, yeah. She lived on 24th Street Drive, First Avenue. Yeah. Betty Schaefer. Mm-hmm.
So, how did you end up get back to flying?
How did I get back to flying?
Yeah, you were in the military.
Yes. General maneuvers took place for the infantry down in Louisiana. And I walked as a second lieutenant with my platoon, Company C, Sykes Regulars, from Fort Leonard Wood to Ruston, Louisiana. Now that's quite a piece to walk. I wore out 2 pair of GI shoes. And I had more chigger bites and mosquito bites than you can imagine. And during that walk, those maneuvers, I kept looking up, and here are airplanes flying over, military airplanes, I might add. I said, that's for me. I had this walking stuff for the birds. So after I got back to Wood, after the maneuvers, I put in for a transfer to go through military pilot training as an officer, not a cadet. And there were very, very few of those that were accepted. And fortunately, out of the big class I was in, there were 6 of us, and I was one of those 6.
So, where was your first assignment?
Well, I went to Tulare, which was Tex Rankin School. Tex Rankin at that time, other than the German ace, of course, was probably the best aerobatic pilot in the world. He's the first guy that did a square loop, if you know what that is. Square loop, you come like so, you put the nose down, you go this way. Then if I could bend my arm, you go this way. Then over here, you go up here, and you fly a square. A normal loop, of course, is a nice, gentle circle. But his plane was such that he had enough power to do what was called a square loop. Tex Rankin.
That's the first I've heard of that maneuver.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, after that training, that was...
About 2 months.
Was that primary?
That was called primary. And just prior to that, I spent a month at Santa Ana, which was pre-flight. Mm-hmm. But being an officer going through, I always pulled OD and stuff like that. It's the first time I ever met Bob Hope, by the way, but I was at Santa Ana then. He came out there. And then, after 2 months at Tulare, we went to Lemoore, which is now a Navy Marine base, but that was a basic training base. Now, at primary, we flew PT-12s. At basic, we got into something a little bigger called a BT basic trainer. Why didn't I bring one of those? Heavens. BT-13A, BT-13. And then, after a couple of months, we were split. Fighter pilots, multi-engine pilots. As you can see by my size, I was not about to become a fighter pilot. So I went multi-engine, and I had that training in bamboo bombers called the C-17 and the A-9, which was a Bearcat of an airplane. These are both multi-engine at Victorville, California. That later became an air base too, and I don't recall the name of it. I'm sorry.
So then you were assigned to what type of?
I did.
What type of work?
After I got my wings, matter of fact, the day I got my wings, side light, I had all 4 wisdom teeth pulled. And then I had to drive to Washington, D.C. with my wife. So I had a 1940 Chevy that I got from this building, from Fletcher's, and it wasn't new. It was a demonstrator that one of the salesmen had, but I got it here, no kidding. And my wife and I had 4 tires. Back in the war days, you couldn't buy tires. We had 4 tires on the car. So this was quite an experience. We had driven out from Iowa air to California. Now we had to go to Washington, D.C. So I was kind of scared to death. We stopped at Cedar Rapids en route, of course. I no sooner got to Washington, 2 days, they said, hey, you're assigned to the first photo wing, which is in Washington, but you're going to the 3rd Photo Recon Squadron, 3rd Photo Mapping Squadron. It was mapping at that time. I said, where's that? They said, down in Florida. So my wife and I got in the Chevy, and now we went down to Florida. Okay, MacDill Air Force Base, at that time it was called MacDill Field. And that's where Jack Walters told you about B-26 a day in Tampa Bay. I got a guy from Cedar Rapids out of those B-26s into my squadron. His name was Bill Watson, who was a classmate of mine at McKinley. He didn't want any part of that 26, and I wanted him in our squadron to have an old-time buddy.
So what was your, in recon mapping, what was your first assignment?
Yeah, it was photo mapping. It was what we call trimetragon. There was one camera with a 40-inch plane. This makes sense to our cameraman. And 2 cameras out the side at angles. So we took photographs from horizon to horizon. Now these 3 photographs were melded together, and they had a way to bring the others into proportion because they were skewed, because of the angle. So to make that a flat surface, they would get them together, and then the photo interpreters would make, these were all overlap photos, and they could make stereo pairs to identify this, that, the other thing. But our mission in Brazil was very simple. The mouth of the Amazon, or the delta, I guess, it's the delta where the river ends, yeah. The delta of the Amazon River, which is almost 200 miles wide, was off on all existing aeronautical charts by over 200 miles. You recall at this time that we were selling a lot of airplanes to the Brits, and they were being transported from the U.S. down the coast to Fortaleza and so on, and on over to Africa and then up to Europe to England. And they were losing planes almost every day down in the Brazil area. So our specific mission was to photograph inland about 200 miles and the entire coast of South America. So these pilots could have up-to-date aeronautical charts. That was our mission.
What type of plane were you flying at this
These
time?
were little tiny things called F-2s. Now the F-2, I flew down to Brazil, Recife specifically, in this particular B-34, which is nothing more than a Lockheed Ventura, which was a passenger airplane converted into a bomber. I might add, this fellow in the photograph with me, a fellow by the name of Moffat, was killed a couple, 3 days later in this aircraft because our squadron commander at that time, Bob Payne, and he crashed into the Andes and lost their lives, along with 3 of our enlisted personnel. So this was a B-34. It was camera equipped, but I flew no missions in Brazil in this. I just flew down in this. Are those the little ones with white tails? Okay. Now the missions in Brazil, as I said earlier, were primarily along the coast and inland several hundred miles to make new aeronautical charts to give the pilots, soon to be going overseas too, I might add, but primarily the English ferry jobs to preclude their running out of gas and crashing so they'd have current maps. This particular photo shows 2 F-2s, which are nothing more than C-45s. And we had white tails for very good reason. In the event we went down in the jungle, you might be able to see the tail at least before the apes or whatever's down there get you. And notice we slept on hammocks geared up between the 2 propellers in this shot. This was taken at Barreiras, which is on the interior of Brazil. We flew up as far as Manaus, where Firestone built that marvelous opera house. I'm sure you've heard of the Manaus Opera House. Okay, that was Brazil.
The next assignment was in the Aleutian Islands, correct?
Well, we were based at McMurray in northern Canada. And yes, we had to map the entire state of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands from Dutch Harbor to Kodiak, all of those island chains almost over to the Soviet Union at that time. And our purpose there was twofold. You've all heard of the Alcan Highway. The engineers used our aerial charts to lay out the Alcan Highway. Number 2 was the super secret mission because no one wanted to know about it. No one was supposed to know about it. We didn't even know, but it was called the Canol Project, C-A-N-O-L, which was to be a refueling base for submarines in the Aleutians. And obviously then, there was drilling from our photographs in this area that President Bush is currently talking about, although the park is far removed from where we were, although we photographed the park that became a park.
Did you mention that was your crew there that you're holding?
Yes. This is my crew, and if you can see it.
What type of plane are you?
Oh, this is a B-25D, and on the nose of it, again, I don't know if you can see the bubbles of one of the side cameras, and again, a 40-inch plane vertical camera. So we did photo mapping of the entire state for the highway and the Canol Project. And aeronautical charts, obviously, too.
After the Aleutian Islands, Frank, your next assignment was?
Well, we returned from the Alaska and the Aleutians and spent a couple days in Spokane, took a couple photographs, and then we returned to MacDill Field where we had new orders to retrain in B-24s. That is, we were going to have 4 B-24s, and guess who? I became the flight commander of those. I'd never been in a 4-engine airplane in my life, and here I had to get checked out and check out my 3 pilots. So Yeah, at MacDill, I picked up my B-24, and Watson, Ellswick, and Kendall picked up theirs. And along with our B-25s that we had in the Aleutians in Alaska, we hightailed it over to the CBI, and our headquarters was Gushkera, India, which I believe is now in Pakistan.
And what was your responsibilities? What were your
I was a flight
mapping?
commander at this time, Jerry.
And what was your group mapping at this time?
Well, we had, the 24s had a little different mission. Although we had cameras, we let the 25s do the mapping. And this was to lay out aeronautical charts once again, but primary for the Burma and the Lido Road, which I'm sure you've heard of. Mm-hmm. And the 24s, we lugged a lot of stuff over the hump from Chabwa to Kunming in the way of fuel, in the way of rations, in the way of this, that, and the other thing, gasoline primarily, for the 25s to operate from there. And, of course, the hump was a treacherous place to fly back then. Our instrumentation was so poor compared to today's sophisticated digital equipment and all of the satellites and things like that. Those stone clouds of the Himalayas going up to 30,000 feet are pretty dangerous.
What altitude did you normally fly at?
To take the photographs, it was always at a true 20,000. That was to give credence to the cartographers for areas, 1 mile equals such and such when they made a map. At 20,000, they could translate that into inches or millimeters equals this, that, and the other.
You have a nice photo here of you in the B-24, young Frank.
Yeah, the old guy with the, that's my old B-24, the old 30 mission hat, they called it. We didn't fly too high in these. Of course, when we got up to past 10,000, we always had to have oxygen. But over there, we didn't wear flak jackets. You can see the armor plating behind our seats. That's real thick metal. And B-24 was a good old bird. It was built in San Diego. It had a unique wing it's called a Davis wing. On the ground, you look out the cockpit window, and you couldn't see the wingtip. Once you lifted off, that wing would just gradually raise up like so, and you look out, and there's the wingtip. It was flexible. So in turbulence, this baby would just wave at you, but it was built like an anvil.
After the China-Burma, you went on to flying B-29s, correct?
Yes, when we came back to MacDill after our mission was complete in China and Burma and India, we were sent from MacDill to Smoky Hill Air Base in Salina, Kansas. And that was the transition base from four-engine equipment like the B-29, B-17, into this new bird that was just off the the line. And as I recall, my checkout was 3 trips around the traffic pattern, and the check pilot says, "Okay, you're checked out, now check your pilots out." Well, it's a little more complicated than that, but back then, time was of essence. So I checked my guys out, and I wound up being a flight commander of Sea Flight in the 3rd Photo Recon Squadron. Now, we changed our name from mapping to recon because General LeMay says you guys are going to be the official photographers of Japan. Our mission, of course, coming up, we'll get into shortly with Jerry.
What was, at this time, what was your targets for your B-29 bomber group?
30 days before the B-29's bombers came over, we established headquarters at Saipan. And Saipan was called Isley Field. Our control tower was a tent. The Seabees were going like crazy trying to build the runway for us. But we started flying missions 30 days before the bombers for one reason particularly, and that was our first mission to get pictures of bomb targets for the 29s that were yet to come. After the 29s came and started their raids, our second mission became not only target dissemination, but bomb damage assessment. In other words, what did the bombs do? Did it destroy this oil plant? Did it destroy this factory? And our third mission was later in the war, toward the end, and it was called monitoring the depth charges in Shimonoseki Straits to keep the Navy, Japanese Navy, bottled up where they wanted it. So in the event a vessel went and hit one of these depth charges, bang, 29s dropped those depth charges. So our mission was primarily to take photographs of Japan for targets of opportunity, and I might add, General LeMay got down to towns of 5,000 that he was going to fireburn. I was on the first mission of when they burned out 54 square miles of Tokyo. I was the recon pilot on that mission. I couldn't believe my eyes because they came in at 5,000 feet and dropped incendiaries. Now keep in mind, every home in Japan was a factory. Your house probably made wire. His house probably made little particles of nuts and bolts and whatever. So LeMay saw fit to firebomb and that way wipe out these little ancillary factories that contributed their parts to the big factory to build an airplane. And he was right. He was right. Although, and I don't know if you know this, more people were killed that night than were killed at Hiroshima. Burned to death. Which is a pretty sad commentary, but keep in mind, we were at war.
Yeah. Did you, were you involved with Nagasaki and Hiroshima, mapping it or photographing it? Or?
Oh, mapping, yes. I flew many missions over both of them. Now, whether or not my pictures were used to produce maps for Paul Tibbets in box, for Nagasaki and Hiroshima, I don't know. But one of my guys in my flight, Tommy Kendall, took all of the pictures of the bomb over Hiroshima. And I believe he took the same over Nagasaki when the hydrogen bomb went off.
Did you ever have any serious incidences?
Well, the only one that was kind of bad, we lost a couple engines over Yokohama. That was our flak alley like in Germany. And fortunately, the Marines had already taken Iwo Jima, a portion of it, not a great deal, but a portion. And I made an emergency landing at Iwo Jima. And had it not been there, I'd had to ditch because I didn't have enough power to make it back to Saipan. And after I landed there on this short runway, I was surrounded by a Marine squad or platoon, I guess it was a squad. I got out of the 29, and here was a Marine sergeant, dirty, face dirty, he hadn't shaved in days, just filthy. And he gave me a highball salute. He says, "Captain," he says, "I'm here to protect your airplane." I said, "Oh boy, that's a good deal. I'm glad to see it," because I could hear mortars going off and rifles, they're up on the hills. And for some reason, I always carried a little whiskey in my airplane. Not for me to drink, but I thought someday these are going to come in handy. Well, guess the day. That was it. I got those 2 bottles off. I said, "Sarge, come on over here. How would you like a drink of bourbon?" He said, "Boy, I'd love it." I said, "Well, here are 2. Give them to all your troops." So that made my day, and I know it made his.
Did you ever carry anything, a rabbit's foot or any Lucky Charm throughout all your...
I'm glad you asked that.
Flight?
January 31st, 1937, my father gave me 2 presents. He gave me a Gruen watch. And if you remember, a Gruen watch was one of these that bent around your wrist. Then he gave me a silver dollar. He said, "Frank, if you put that silver dollar in your pocket and always carry it, you'll never go broke." Well, it meant a lot more to me than not going broke, because I carried this on every mission I ever flew. And I still carry it every day today. I've never been broke. I'm not wealthy, but I'll never be broke because I've got my dad's silver dollar.
What was your rank, Frank, while you were flying all of these missions?
Well, I was a captain, Jerry, but when the war was over, I happened to be at Hawaii on rest leave, and I never got back to my original squadron. I took a tramp steamer from Hawaii back to San Francisco, And at San Francisco, at the Army base there, I was put in charge of a troop train to go to Jefferson Barracks with all these fellas. So we went across country to Jefferson Barracks from San Francisco area in many, many days, and most of those fellows were relieved of their Army duty. And at that time, I was released from active duty as a major.
So, back to Cedar Rapids.
Back to Cedar Rapids.
And was the job hard to come by when you got back?
No, you recall a lot of women took the men's jobs during the war, so jobs were plentiful if you'd bought off of her job. But so many of us were, kind of unrest, what is the word? We were still disturbed, I guess, is a good word, and we just couldn't settle down too quickly. Keep in mind now, my son was almost 2 years old, and I'd only seen him once. By the way, my B-29 was named Blue Boots after my boy, the guy that you know, Jerry. Mm-hmm. I always carried his little knit stockings up in my mag compass. But I bounced around at three jobs, but I wound up out at Lee Crawford's quarry. And I became the superintendent of that quarry for a couple of years, and suddenly in the mail comes, hey, you're a B-29 pilot, we need you to train guys for Korea. So, being a commissioned officer, I had to answer the call again.
Did you look forward to this, or did you kind of...
Well, yes and no,
thoughts?
it was sort of a mixed bag. I had a baby girl born in the interim, so here I had my family, and
what was
I thought,
her name?
Ann. Bill and Ann were our kids, and I hated it, and yet I liked it. I wanted to fly again, I know that. And so I went into Chicago, took a physical, and suddenly I came back to Cedar Rapids. They said report to Lackland in Texas. I went down there, and they re-outfitted me, because in the interim, when I got out to now, you see, it's after 1947, the uniforms went from tan to blue. I had no uniforms other than my old brown belt and so on. So I had to be completely re-uniformed. And first time I ever had on blues, and same for summer uniforms. And at Lackland, I was sent for a refresher at Hondo, flew AT-6s just to brush up, do a few snap rolls and things like that. Then they assigned me back to Randolph at San Antonio, Texas, which was a combat crew training center for B-29s for Korea. And I was head of a flight again called Sea Flight, or Zebra, I guess it was, Zebra Flight, yeah. And we trained pilots on one side of Randolph. Our field was named Hangnail. The main field was over here. Taj Mahal was in the center. You can visualize Randolph had two parallel runways. And this side were training crew members. This side was training the pilots. Well, my job was to train pilots, which I did. And I'm lost. Oh, these would be combined then, the pilots and the crews, of course, to become a combat crew for Korea. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Then in 55, did you and your family move to Japan, or get transferred to Japan?
Not in 55, in 58.
58?
Yes. We were at Randolph yet from 55 to 58. In 58, yes, we went to Japan.
The whole family?
I went 3 months earlier than they. They arrived just before Christmas in 58.
How did you find living in Japan? Did you enjoy it? Or?
Yes, I rented what was called a private rental, meaning it wasn't a military base. And strange as it may seem, we lived across the street in Shibuya-ku from the then Prime Minister, Kushi was his name. And our son Bill would always walk our dog, and Mr. Kushi, the Prime Minister, would walk his, and these two guys would talk together out walking their dog. Here's a little guy in ninth grade, talking to the Prime Minister of Japan. Lived right across the street from us.
What was your duties in Japan?
Well, it's one of the most invigorating jobs I ever had. I became the Deputy OIC, Deputy Officer in Charge, of the Pacific Stars and Stripes, which had the largest distribution system in the world of any newspaper. It went all over the Mideast, wherever we had, or Mideast, it went all over where we had troops. And this is just a little pamphlet I brought along. It's the paper was tabloid size, and it came out daily, Monday through Sunday. And gosh, it went to Korea. It went to all the islands where we had troops. We had regular routes for airplanes to take this paper all over. And this was a second cousin, really, of the European Stars and Stripes that began in World War I. And it was a very exciting assignment. And although this was my primary duty, I flew out of Tachikawa. And I usually flew stuff over to Korea or down to Okinawa or things like that.
How did you find the Japanese people? Did you feel any animosity there from the World War II?
No, not really. All I can say is crowds. Boy, walk down the street, you just masses of people, like our freeways are here.
Okay. So when you come back from Japan, you come back to where?
Let's see, from Pacific Stars and Stripes, I was assigned to Purdue University at West Lafayette, Indiana.
And then...
I guess they thought I could teach.
And then you got called up for the Vietnam, or did you have any connection with the Vietnam War?
Yes. Let's see. From Purdue, I went to Armed Forces Radio in Hollywood. And from Hollywood, I went over to Vietnam and helped establish all the radio and TV stations in Vietnam for that particular conflict. And, of course, I was there during Tet when I lost a heck of a lot of men and cameramen. And most of them were Marines and soldiers, and some Air Force.
So when did you finally end up leaving the military?
I left the military March 1st, 1969, and retired as a colonel. 1969.
Full colonel?
Yes.
And then what did Frank decide to do?
Well, 3 days later, I started work as an instructor at Continental Airlines in the 727 stretch job. And soon the DC-10s came, and I became an instructor in that. Now, mind you, I did not fly the line. I did not instruct in the actual airplane. I taught systems such as hydraulics, pneumatics, electrical, things of this nature. I used the CPT, Cockpit Procedure Trainer, so they know their scans, they know their instruments and stuff like this. And I taught that in both 727 and the DC-10. And I prepared the captains and the second officers for their orals so they could get through the FAA examination, which was oral. And I must say, everyone I ever taught passed, for which I'm very proud.
Did you stay with them long enough to get a lifetime pass?
At 10 and a half years, I said sayonara, because I knew I'd have a pass in my hands then. Do you want to see it? And I knew I had a little retirement salary coming from.
I want to ask you, Frank, what was the thoughts that went through your mind on September 11th last year when they crashed planes into the World Trade Center?
I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I couldn't believe it. I called several of my friends. I'm a member of Dedalian. I don't know if you've ever heard of Dedalians or not. Dedalian is a member of a military fraternity of pilots. And all of us talk on the phones. We have a meeting once a month. And like most people who have seen war, they just couldn't believe this tactic. You know, who's your enemy? A United Airlines airplane's our enemy? Well, in this case it was. Of course, it wasn't the crew flying it. And how do you combat this? How do you combat these kids with dynamite on their bellies, you know, blowing up to kill children? The embassy that was been bombed over in the Mideast, I can remember back in 42 flying along Saudi Arabia. They said, don't ever go down there. You're an infidel. They'll kill you. This is way back when. And my reactions for 9/11, I gave money immediately, I know. I went down to the fire station, shook hands with some firemen. I was just flabbergasted. I knew I wish I were younger so I could do something, but I can't. I'm too old, I'm blind.
Frank, in all the years you've flown planes, how many hours do you suppose you logged in that entire time?
Right around 11,000, Jerry.
Yeah. Mm. What could an airline pilot expect to rack up in a? Is that a large number of hours?
No, it isn't, not compared to an airline. I know many airline pilots who have retired that have well over 30, 40,000 hours. Now keep in mind, they usually fly specific routes, say San Francisco, Boston, Boston to Miami, Miami to Boston, Boston, San Francisco. That's a lot of flying time by the time they get through with that 3-day trip, say. So military, your missions weren't that long, you see. Or training missions weren't that long. Mm-hmm. Training mission normally in a 4-engine equipment was 4 hours. Shoot, touch and go landings and things of that nature. Blind landings with GCA and so on. But airline pilots rack up a lot of time. I don't know of any military pilots. Oh, Wally Schirra, sure, you know, he went around the world several times. He flew many millions of miles, but no, military pilots, I guess a lot of them get out with 20, 25,000, but I didn't have that much.
Okay. How would you like to introduce your wife?
Oh, I would.
Frank?
My wife, this is my bride of 61 years, Jerry.
61 years.
Yeah, Betty and I met on the co-campus. She was a freshman and I was a junior at that time. And I always preferred blondes, but she was a cute brunette, so... And I think she's still pretty cute.
Are you were a Cedar Rapids girl, Betty?
Yes, not born here, but
Where were you born?
in LaGrange, Illinois. Mm-hmm. But I lived here most of my life. My parents moved here early on.
So how many children do you end up with? Just
We
two?
have two.
Two children?
We have our son Bill, and he is currently with the Erskine Clinic here in Cedar Rapids, a radiologist, and he has 2 children, Ethan and Kristen. Kristen is now at Harvard working on her doctorate, and her husband is Pat, and they gave us our great grandbaby a year ago, April, and her name is Aiden.
A year ago, February.
A year ago, February.
February 13th.
Right.
Good.
And our daughter Ann is associated with the publication of the San Diego History Museum Bird Atlas. It's a huge project, and it's been about 5 years now in the making, and publication will be likely in about another year. So we're excited about that. It's a forerunner.
Mm-hmm. If you had anything to do over in your lifetime, Frank, is there anything you wished you would have done that you didn't get a chance to do?
Anything I wish I could have done that I didn't get to do?
You wished you could have been an astronaut, or?
No, I never had aspirations. That came after my life, so to speak. You know, no, I wish I could have been a scratch golfer and played on the pro circuit, although I have a few holes in one since I retired.
You finally retired in 1979. What have you done?
Well, Betty and I retired, so to speak. I was at age 60 and Betty was at age 58. And I always said it was 3 G's: gardening, golf, and guests. Those first years, we had somebody in that spare room almost every weekend, it seemed. Primarily from Iowa, incidentally.
Did you get a chance to do a lot of traveling?
Where'd we go?
Well, we lived in Japan,
Yes, he mentioned.
and yes, we have done considerable traveling. We've gone to Europe a couple of times. We've enjoyed several trips to Hawaii, and then we moved around so much while in the Air Force that we got readily acquainted with Texas and Alabama and good old Indiana and California. So not a whole lot of traveling, but all we wanted to do, really, I think, wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you want to pass on to your grandchildren, Frank? Any advice?
Well, advice. I was going to say, if I had $1 million, I'd pass that on, but I don't have $1 million. No, I think our grandkids are getting along fine. We're just so anxious to see our our grandson's with his father right now, and that new grandbaby is the apple of our eye right now, I guess. So we're so anxious to have that joint birthday party tomorrow night.
Unless you have any other thing to add, the Cedar Rapids History Center, the Linn County Historical Society would like to thank you very much for both of you sharing your memories with us.
Thank you, Jerry. It's been very, very interesting, and we certainly want to thank your photographer.
Well,
Been very kind, very kind.